What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having, at the very least, an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her, via DMS, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Found out after his death that my great-uncle was a grand wizard in the KKK. Opened a chest in his attic with photos from rallies, lynchings, and cross-burnings all around some rural part of Alabama. We were actually horrified by the discovery and suddenly realized why he was so negative towards his black hospice nurse, who was otherwise kind-hearted and caring with him and the family. Edit, since a very large number of you want to keep calling me racist / telling me how much of a fuck-up I was for burning everything. We, as in my family, I was 16 at the time and had no real say in what the adults / elders decided. We decided to burn all of it out of intense shame for what we discovered. We held prayer vigils through our local church for the people affected by his hatred. Had I been older, I might have taken some of the more damning photos and forwarded them to people who could have brought closure to victims. I made this post at great risk to remaining in my family, as they would still see this as romanticizing his actions. To my family, simply speaking, his name is done so at great risk to your standing on will / remaining part of the family. So yes, I do feel like it's too late, because the only thing I have is that my uncle was a member of the KKK for an unknown amount of time before 1950. My family has prided itself in being very inclusive towards other races / ethnic backgrounds. My 7th-generation great-grandfather was a member of the Underground Railroad. Several of my other great-aunts and uncles were vocal figureheads of the civil rights movement. They acted as anyone with that much history behind them would in a moment of shock. They destroyed. Blame them if you wish, but please stop blaming me. I didn't make any decisions, and for me it's too late to report anything because I don't have any useful information on something that happened a very long time ago for me. I do sincerely apologize to anyone who sees their chances for closure going up in flames, but I can assure you that for how many other Klansmen I saw in those photos, surely some of their families have already submitted evidence after their passing. My uncle has literally been deleted from our family history, even in such detail as to remove his gravestone so that people cannot leave flowers for him. She was my best friend of 7 years, we had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her, after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said screw it, let's go back, she's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner, we all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan before us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him, she just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now, BTW. My former church youth pastor was raping an acquaintance of mine for years and inadvertently caused his death. I met this boy and the youth pastor when I was in middle school. The boy was gay and it was pretty well known. He was not a regular member of the church, just occasional teen group activities. The first time I ever met the youth pastor, I asked a friend if he was gay. They told me I was crazy. Well, I wasn't. This man was beloved by everyone, and I mean loved. He was the youth leader for over a decade. The last time I ever saw the boy, we were about 16. I ran into him at a store. He told me what had been happening all these years and that he was finally strong enough to expose him. He told me that either he was going to make the youth pastor confess to the church or he would go to the police. As far as I know, he followed through with this confrontation because the very next week, the head pastor announced to the church that our youth pastor was quitting, moving back to his home state to go work at the grocery store he used to work at. Yes, a freaking grocery store. They threw him a farewell party. I never saw the boy again, but I do know he didn't get justice because the youth pastor did exactly what he told the church he was going to do. The boy went into a tailspin, as his cousin told me years later, was depressed and got hooked on drugs. He overdosed when we were 19. I have lived with this for years and kick myself for not saying something too. I don't know if I can now. If anyone thinks I can and something will be done, I do know where that youth pastor is now. I don't know how disturbing this is, it turned out pretty fantastic for one. But not for another. I was adopted, and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went, into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother, she died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that, I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory. And was raped by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple trees. Bent the fucker to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday? Fuck yeah, I did. That was your uncle's. Her mother's brother? Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old treehouse out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. Edit, the uncle in question is now dead. Died June 16th. My mom sat me down at 16 and told me she walked in on my grandfather molesting me at 2 weeks old. No one is sure when it stopped. I always felt off and had anxiety/depression, but as soon as she told me, she also explained it happened to her. She knew he was a monster yet continued letting me be raised by him. I had all the symptoms growing up, including wetting the bed until I was 13. I told people growing up I knew something was wrong and people told me I was a dramatic girl or that I was a liar. He re-offended a few years ago. That's when people started to believe me. Honestly, it's rough and spending your whole life being invalidated, invisible, and just really alone. I'm in my 30s and still am very just lost and feel completely hopeless. I'm not sure how to move on. I apologize for the ramble. I have never written out how I felt. It's weird reading it. I will probably remove this because I want to continue to stay invisible, but I saw others on the forum share their stories. Edit, I want to thank everyone for their well wishes. I can't believe how many people reached out. Thank you for the awards. Sometimes it's easy to forget how many good people are in the world. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope all of you are doing the absolute best you can be. My grandfather is a ghost on paper. We always grew up knowing he had skeletons in his closet, but I wasn't prepared for what he had done in his younger years. I started hearing rumors as a teen that he had been a pretty big-time robber. His specialty was cracking the safes. But he would never admit it. In 2016, he randomly told me he also used to deal guns to the IRA like he was talking about the weather. It was bizarre. He also told me he helped a couple of triads hide out in Jamaica after they went on the run for beheading an adversary. They were fairly nice guys according to him. It was only about 10 years ago he finally stopped sleeping with guns stashed under his bed and taking shady phone calls down the bottom of the garden. Only my grandmother knows his real name, no one else in the family does. I adore him, but he is an enigma to me.